Some things leave marks that no amount of time can fully erase, not on your skin, but somewhere deeper in the part of you that used to believe the person sleeping beside you would never become the thing you feared most. I know that now. I learned it on a Tuesday night in November, when the rain came down so hard it rattled the kitchen window, and my husband's hand came down harder. I didn't scream. That surprised me, even then. After everything that had built up over 3 years of marriage, the small cruelties, the money I handed over, the friends I stopped calling because he didn't like them when the moment finally arrived, I didn't make a sound. I just hit the linoleum floor of our Seattle apartment and lay there, one hand pressed to my ribs, watching his shoes pace back and forth in front of me like a metronome. His name was Carter Wills. When we met, he was the kind of man who held doors open and remembered what you ordered at coffee shops. He laughed easily, spent money generously, and told me on our third date that I was the most grounded person he had ever known. I was 28 and working as a pediatric nurse at Cascade Children's Hospital. I thought I had finally found someone worth keeping. I didn't see the other version of him until after we were married. That night, he was furious about money. He was always furious about money. But this time, it was the joint savings account I had opened in both our names when we moved in together. He had drained it twice before. Each time, I asked and he explained, and I believed him. This time, I asked to see the bank statements, and that was apparently unforgivable. "You think I'm stealing from you?" His voice had that particular flatness that was worse than shouting, that cold, quiet register that meant the performance was over. "You think I would do that to my own wife?" I told him I didn't think anything. I just wanted to see the numbers. He kicked the cabinet beside my head. The sound split the air, and I flinched so hard I knocked my own shoulder into the counter coming down. Pain cracked through my ribs on the left side, sharp, immediate, unlike anything I had felt before. I couldn't breathe around it. I curled on the floor and pressed my hand there, trying to hold myself together. Carter looked down at me. Something moved across his face, not regret, not even recognition. He just checked his phone, slid it into his pocket, and said he was going out. The front door shut. I lay on the kitchen floor and counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3. The rain kept going. From down the hall came the sound I had been dreading, the soft creak of a door, the patter of small feet, and then my son's voice. "Mama?" Noah was 5 years old. He had my eyes and Carter's jaw and a way of tilting his head when something troubled him that made my chest cave in every time. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his dinosaur pajamas, clutching the stuffed rabbit he had slept with since he was a year old. He stared at me on the floor and didn't say anything for a moment. I tried to smile. "I'm okay, baby. I just slipped." He looked at the cabinet. He looked at me. He was 5 years old, but he was not fooled. He had heard too much by then. I hated myself for that, for how much he had heard. He walked over carefully and sat down on the floor next to me, pressing his small back against the cabinet and tucking himself under my arm. We stayed like that for a while. I didn't cry. I had trained myself out of crying months ago because it made things worse. After a few minutes, Noah reached into the pocket of his pajama pants. Those little pajamas have the smallest pockets, and pulled out my cell phone. I had left it on the coffee table before dinner. I didn't know he had taken it. He held it out to me very seriously. "Call Grandpa," he said. I stared at him. "Grandpa makes things better," he said. "That's what Grandpa does." My father, Roy Callahan, was not a wealthy man. He was a retired high school history teacher from Portland who drove a 12-year-old truck and grew tomatoes in his backyard and called every Sunday at 7:30 without fail. He was the most consistent person I had ever known. When my mother passed during my junior year of college, he raised the money for my last 2 semesters by selling his bass boat, which he loved more than almost anything in the world. He never told me that directly. I found out years later from my aunt. Carter had never liked him. He said my father was judgmental and that every visit left him feeling surveilled. I had slowly, over the course of our marriage, stopped inviting my father to things, stopped answering his Sunday calls in front of Carter, learned to call back from the hospital parking lot, talking fast, watching for Carter's car. Noah had only met my father a handful of times. He remembered every one of them. I looked at my son sitting on the kitchen floor in his dinosaur pajamas holding out my phone like it was something sacred, and I felt the last of whatever had been holding me in place give way. I took the phone and called my father. He picked up on the second ring. It was after 10 at night. He sounded alert immediately, the way parents do when something is wrong. "Dad," I said, and then I couldn't say anything else for a moment. He didn't ask me to explain. He said, "What's the address, sweetheart?" I told him. He said, "Lock the bedroom door. Don't open it until I knock 3 times. I'm leaving right now." The drive from Portland to Seattle is 3 hours in good weather. My father made it in just under 2.5. I don't know how fast he drove. I never asked. Noah and I locked ourselves in the bedroom, and I sat against the door with my arm around him and his rabbit, and we waited. My ribs ached every time I took a full breath. I was almost certain at least one was cracked. I had treated enough pediatric patients to know what that kind of pain meant. I just breathed through it and held my son and counted the minutes. Carter didn't come back that night. That should have been a relief. Instead, it made me more afraid, in the way that silence after a storm sometimes feels worse than the storm itself. My father knocked 3 times at 12:47 in the morning. When I opened the door and saw him gray-haired and tired, still in the flannel shirt he must have grabbed off the back of a chair when he left, his eyes going immediately to my side where I was holding myself, I started crying after all. I couldn't stop it. He held me for a long time. Then he held Noah, who fell asleep on his shoulder in approximately 4 minutes. He laid my son on the bed and covered him with the blanket, and then he came back to the doorway and looked at me and said, "Tell me everything." I told him. It took a long time. I told him about the money, the savings account, the earlier times when Carter had shoved me or grabbed my arm or thrown something close enough to make me flinch. I told him about the friends I had stopped seeing and the Sunday calls I had answered in parking lots. I told him about the way I had convinced myself, over and over, that it wasn't really that bad, that I could manage it, that leaving would mean failure. My father listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are not staying here another night." I said, "Noah's school." He said, "I'll drive him to school from Portland if I have to." We packed 2 bags in 40 minutes. I took Noah's rabbit and his favorite blanket and his backpack with the school books in it. I took my nursing credentials and our passports and the folder of documents I had put together months ago, almost without letting myself know why birth certificates, Noah's medical records, our marriage license, the lease on the apartment. I had gathered them and put them in a waterproof folder in the back of my closet. Some part of me had been preparing even when I told myself I wasn't. My father loaded everything into his truck, and we drove away before 2 in the morning. Noah slept across the back seat. I watched the lights of Seattle disappear in the side mirror and pressed my hand against my ribs and breathed. The hospital near my father's house confirmed it the next morning. 2 cracked ribs. The doctor, a quiet woman named Dr. Okafor, asked me twice how it had happened. The second time she asked, she held my gaze and didn't write anything down, and I understood she was giving me a chance. I told her the truth. I told her all of it. She documented everything. She took photographs, she gave me a pamphlet for the county domestic violence advocacy program, and the name of a legal aid lawyer she had referred patients to before. Her name was Margaret Solano, and she had a reputation, Dr. Okafor said, for not losing. I called Margaret Solano that afternoon from my father's kitchen table, while Noah drew pictures of dinosaurs at the other end. She answered on the first ring, and her first question was, "Are you safe right now?" I looked at my father standing at the stove making soup. I looked at Noah drawing a stegosaurus. "Yes," I said. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." What followed was not a clean process. I want to be honest about that. There was nothing cinematic about the next several weeks. It was paperwork and phone calls and learning vocabulary. I had never wanted to know protective orders and asset freezes and custody petitions and financial affidavits. It was Noah asking where Daddy was and me telling him Daddy was dealing with some things and watching my son accept that answer in a way that told me he had expected something like it for a long time. That was the part that undid me, quietly, every time. Carter, meanwhile, did what Carter always did when cornered. He performed. He called, first with apologies. He said he had been under tremendous pressure and that he loved me and that nothing like that would ever happen again. The calls were recorded with Margaret's guidance. Then he switched to anger. He texted me that I had broken up our family, that I was using Noah as a weapon, that I would regret this. Those were also saved. Then he went quiet for 10 days, which Margaret said was when people were usually most dangerous, and during those 10 days I slept badly and kept the porch light on and was grateful for my father's presence in the house. Then Margaret called me on a Thursday morning with a particular tone in her voice, the tone of someone who has found something. "Can you come to my office today?" she said. "There are some things you should see in person." My father drove me. We sat across from Margaret in her small, book-crowded office, and she opened a folder on her desk. "Over the past 2 weeks," she said, "I've had a forensic accountant review the financial records we subpoenaed. I need to walk you through what we found." The joint savings account had not simply been drained by poor decisions. The money, almost entirely. Since Carter had been inconsistently employed for the past 2 years, despite his stories about contracts and clients, had been transferred through a series of transactions to an account held by a limited liability company called Meridian Lifestyle Solutions, LLC. The company had been incorporated 18 months ago. Carter was not the listed owner. The owner of record was a woman named Danielle Park. "Who is Danielle Park?" my father asked. Margaret turned her laptop to show us. I looked at the photograph on the screen and felt the floor shift slightly beneath me. She was in her late 20s. I recognized her as someone Carter had mentioned once, casually, as a former colleague from a consulting job he'd had before we were married. I had seen her name in his phone twice, and both times accepted his explanation before I even fully formed the question. "They have been in a relationship for approximately 2 years, Margaret said. Our investigator confirmed it. She continued, watching my face. "There's more." She slid a photograph across the desk. It was taken with a long lens, unclear but unmistakable. Carter and Danielle, outside an apartment building in Bellevue. He had a key. Beside him, Danielle was holding the hand of a small child, a boy, perhaps 3 years old. The air went out of the room. "He has a son," Margaret said quietly. "With her. The child appears to be approximately 3 years of age. We're still confirming details, but the timing corresponds with the 2nd year of your marriage." I looked at the photograph for a long time. My father put his hand over mine on the table and didn't say anything. 3 years of marriage. Noah was 5. Which meant that while I was nursing and cooking and believing his explanations and handing over every dollar from my mother's life insurance payout, which I had told Carter was for our future, he had been building a separate life, a parallel household, an actual family in Bellevue, 20 minutes from our apartment, with a woman whose name I had been trained to accept without question. And Meridian Lifestyle Solutions, Margaret continued, was the mechanism. The company is essentially a shell. It has a registered agent address and almost no activity, but it received direct transfers totaling $94,000 from accounts in your name over 18 months. We believe it was used primarily to pay rent on the Bellevue apartment and fund personal expenses for both of them. $94,000. My mother's life insurance. The savings I had built through double shifts and holiday rotations and 3 years of choosing not to spend money on things I wanted. All of it funneled, quietly and systematically, to another woman and another child. I sat in Margaret's office and made the same decision Sophia made in that story, the same decision every woman in that position eventually has to make, the one that comes when there is nothing left to lose except the truth. I said, "I want to go all the way." Margaret nodded like she had been waiting for that. The protective order had already been filed and granted. The asset freeze went through that same week, covering every joint account and any account Carter had opened in the last 3 years. When it hit, his phone began ringing on my end again, first confused, then outraged, then, briefly, falsely calm. Each message was forwarded to Margaret. Carter's mother, Eleanor Wills, called me on a Sunday. I had always found Eleanor difficult, a woman who loved her son in the particular way that refuses to see him clearly. She showed up at my father's house without warning on a Sunday afternoon, and my father let her in because he is a man who believes in hearing people out. She sat at the kitchen table and told me I had destroyed her son. She told me Noah needed his father. She told me Carter had made mistakes. She said it exactly that way, mistakes, plural but minimized, but that he was a good man underneath, and that I had pushed him to his limits by questioning him the way I did. I had pushed him. I listened to Eleanor Wills tell me I had pushed her son to crack 2 of my ribs, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. I said, "Eleanor, I'm going to ask you to leave now." She said, "You'll regret treating this family this way." My father walked her to the door. She left a ring of coffee on the table from a cup she had never touched. 2 days later, Carter made his last attempt. He filed an emergency motion through his own attorney, a man named Douglas, claiming I had taken Noah across state lines without consent and was interfering with his parental rights. He listed himself as the primary caregiver and suggested in the filing that I had a history of emotional instability related to stress in the workplace. Margaret read the motion over the phone to me. I was sitting in the break room at the Portland hospital where I had picked up per diem nursing shifts, and I listened to Douglas's language about my emotional instability, and I felt, for approximately 30 seconds, the old familiar fear. Then I thought about what Carter's motion required. It required a judge to look at both of us. It required a hearing. It required evidence. I had Dr. Okafor's photographs of my ribs. I had 4 months of recorded calls. I had the financial forensics. I had Carter's text messages. I had Margaret. I said to Margaret, "Let's give them their hearing." The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in February. I drove up from Portland the night before and stayed with a colleague who had an apartment near Capitol Hill. I barely slept. I lay in the dark and thought about Noah, who had been slowly, carefully beginning to settle at my father's house, who was sleeping better, eating more, who had come home from kindergarten last week and talked about his teacher for 45 uninterrupted minutes, which was something he had never done before. I thought about the boy in the photograph outside the Bellevue apartment, Carter's other son. I had started to think of him by then not with anger, because that child hadn't done anything, but with a particular sorrow for him that the man holding his hand was the same man who kicked me onto a kitchen floor. The morning of the hearing, I wore a navy blazer over a white shirt, and I pulled my hair back and I sat down at the plaintiff's table next to Margaret, and I waited. Carter came in with Douglas. He looked different, thinner in a way that wasn't healthy, with the particular hollowness of someone who has been spending energy on anger. He looked at me once when he sat down and then looked away. What happened over the following 4 hours was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There was no music and no gallery gasping. There was a judge named the Honorable Patricia Swan, who wore reading glasses and asked precise questions and did not appear impressed by Douglas's language about emotional instability. There were the forensic accountant's figures laid out in black and white. There was Dr. Okafor's report. There was Margaret presenting the wire transfer records from my accounts into Meridian Lifestyle Solutions, and the Bellevue lease in Danielle Park's name, and the record showing the child enrolled in a Bellevue preschool under Carter Wills listed as parent. There was one moment that I will not forget. Judge Swan looked over her reading glasses at Carter and asked him, in a tone entirely without emphasis, whether he could explain the transfers from the joint marital account to an LLC he claimed no knowledge of. Carter looked at Douglas. Douglas made a small movement with his hand. Carter said he had made some investments through a third party. Judge Swan said, "Investments in what?" Carter said, "Real estate opportunities." Judge Swan said, "I see," and wrote something down. The temporary custody arrangement was granted in my favor that afternoon, pending the full hearing. Carter was granted supervised visitation 2 hours per week at a family services center. The asset freeze remained. Margaret told me afterward that the full proceeding would likely take another 3 to 4 months and that she was confident about our position. I walked out of the courthouse into a cold February afternoon and called my father. He answered before the first ring finished. I could hear Noah in the background asking if Mama had called. "Tell him yes," I said. "Tell him Mama called." The months that followed were the hardest kind of hard, not dramatic, not acute, just long and requiring. I drove between Portland and Seattle for appointments and depositions. I picked up nursing shifts wherever I could get them, and I paid my father a nominal rent that he put in an envelope and gave back to me at Christmas. Noah started first grade at a school 3 blocks from my father's house and made a best friend named Tobias who was obsessed with volcanoes, and watching my son become someone who had a best friend obsessed with volcanoes was one of the things that kept me going when the depositions were bad. Carter, through Douglas, continued to try to reframe everything. He suggested in filings that I was alienating Noah from his father, that I had manufactured evidence of financial abuse, that the forensic accountant was operating outside appropriate methodology. Douglas was a competent attorney, and he did not give up easily. Margaret was better, and she did not give up at all. The full trial was scheduled for May. By then, through discovery, we had confirmed additional information. Danielle Park had been aware for at least 18 months that Carter was married. She had signed documents on the Meridian LLC as owner of record, meaning she had functioned as a willing participant in the financial structure. Margaret added her to a separate civil complaint for conspiracy to commit financial fraud. When that filing landed, something cracked. Danielle Park hired her own attorney, separate from Douglas, and Danielle Park's attorney 3 weeks before the trial contacted Margaret with an offer. Her client, the attorney said, was prepared to provide a full, signed accounting of all transactions through Meridian Lifestyle Solutions, including dates, amounts, and purposes, in exchange for being named as a cooperating party rather than a primary defendant in the civil matter. Margaret called me. She's willing to testify, Margaret said, to all of it. She says Carter told her you were already separated when they got together. She says she didn't know the full scope until after the LLC was established, but she knew enough, and she's willing to put that in writing. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about a woman in her late 20s who had believed a man's version of his marriage, or had chosen to believe it, or had stopped caring about the truth somewhere along the way. I thought about her son Carter's son, who was now 3 years old and whose life was also being rearranged by the thing his father had built. I said, "Tell her attorney we'll consider it." We accepted the cooperation agreement. What Danielle provided was, as Margaret put it, the capstone, a signed, detailed accounting of how my money moved, where it went, what it funded. Carter had been telling Danielle, according to her account, that the money was his from a settlement he couldn't disclose. She had believed him, or mostly believed him. When she stopped believing him, she had already signed enough documents to feel implicated. The trial lasted 3 days. I testified for most of the second day. I told the truth steadily and completely, the way I had practiced with Margaret, without performance and without apology. Carter's attorney challenged me repeatedly on the question of why I had remained in the marriage if conditions were as I described. I answered honestly, because I had believed it would get better, and then because I was afraid, and then because I thought leaving would damage Noah, and finally because my son sat down on a kitchen floor and handed me a phone and said, "Grandpa makes things better." There was a woman in the second row of the gallery who covered her mouth when I said that. The verdict on the criminal charges assault, financial fraud, wire transfer fraud came down on a Thursday afternoon. Carter received 42 months for the assault and fraud counts, with additional civil liability on the financial judgment. Danielle Park received a suspended sentence and formal cooperation status, with 5 years of supervised probation. She moved, I was told later, to Tucson with her son. I did not wish her well exactly, but I did not wish her harm. Carter's mother, Eleanor, was present for the verdict. She left the courtroom without looking at me. I did not require her to look at me. I walked out of the courthouse for the second time, this time into a May afternoon that was genuinely warm, Seattle spring warm. And my father was waiting at the bottom of the steps with Noah, who had been told we were going out to celebrate something important. Noah ran up the steps and grabbed my hands. "Did we win, Mama?" he asked. I looked at my son, first grader, rabbit carrier, friend of Tobias who loves volcanoes, the boy who sat on a kitchen floor and pressed himself under my arm and handed me a phone. "Yes," I said. "We won," he said. "Can we get pizza?" My father laughed. The sound of it went up into the May air and I held on to it. That was 2 years ago. There are things I know now that I didn't know then, things I want to say to anyone who is lying on a floor somewhere counting their breaths and telling themselves they can manage it. The first is that silence never protects anyone. I stayed quiet for 3 years because I believed quiet would keep the peace, protect Noah, make the space between Carter's eruptions longer. It never did. Silence fed the thing. It grew in quiet. The only thing that stopped it was the night I stopped being silent, which was the night my son handed me a phone and I called my father, which is to say, the only thing that stopped it was finally asking for help. The second is that you cannot stay for your children. I believed for a long time that leaving would hurt Noah more than staying. I watch him now, second grade. Taller, louder, who falls asleep without fear and talks about his teacher and his best friend and his opinions about dinosaurs with a confidence I don't remember him having before. And I understand that what children need is not an intact household. They need a parent who is not afraid. The third thing, and this is the one I have thought about most, is that what happens after is also yours to shape. The healing is not passive. I chose it actively every day in small and large ways. I went back to full-time nursing at a children's hospital in Portland. I joined a peer support group for survivors of domestic abuse, and after a year of attending, I began co-facilitating. I sat with women in rooms that smelled like coffee and institutional carpet and listened to stories that were different from mine and exactly like mine, and I told them what my son told me, that asking for help is not weakness. It is the most powerful instinct we have. It is what saves us when we finally allow it. Last fall, my father built Noah a raised garden bed in the backyard. They planted tomatoes together, the way my father has always grown tomatoes, and Noah came inside with dirt on his knees and an expression of absolute pride and said they were going to have the best tomatoes in the whole neighborhood. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them in the late afternoon light. My father with his hand on my son's shoulder, showing him how to press the soil around the base of the plant, and I thought about the night I called him from that apartment floor. The way he said, "What's the address, sweetheart?" The way he didn't hesitate. I am someone who knows now what I am worth. I learned it the hard way through loss and fear and a long recovery that is still ongoing, that will probably always be ongoing in small ways. But I know it. My worth is not negotiable. My son's safety is not negotiable. The life I am building room by room, day by day, tomato plant by tomato plant, is mine. No one is going to take it from me again. If any part of what I've shared today echoes something you're carrying right now, please don't carry it alone. Tell someone. Call someone. Let someone come. The call you're afraid to make might be the one that changes everything. It was for me. What did this story bring up for you? I would really love to hear from you in the comments. Your words matter more than you know, and they might be exactly what someone else needs to read today.